Greetings from the National Archives. I'm David Ferriero, Archivist of the United States, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this virtual book talk. Our special guest, Mitchell Yockelson, will be on screen soon to tell us about his book, The Paratrooper Generals, Matthew Ridgway, Maxwell Taylor, and the American Airborne, from D-Day through Normandy. Before we get to Mitch, I want to tell you about two online programs we will be presenting on Constitution Day, which is Thursday, September 17th. At noon, in partnership with the United States Association of Former Members of Congress, we'll present a discussion on the Electoral College and the Constitution. Panelists will include Congressman Jamie Raskin, former Member of Congress Bob Goodlatte, and Georgetown Professor of Law Anthony Cook. And then at 5 p.m., political savant and entertainment veteran Ben Sheehan will discuss his book, OMG, WTF Does the Constitution Actually Say? A non-boring guide to how our democracy is supposed to work. An entertaining and accessible guide that explains what the Constitution actually lays out while putting it in modern-day English so that it can be understood. By the way, OMG WTF refers to Ohio, Michigan, Georgia, Wisconsin, Texas, and Florida, the name of the group Ben founded in 2018 to teach voters about executive races during the midterm elections. You can view both of these programs on the National Archives YouTube channel. D-Day, June 6, 1944, was the opening strike of Operation Overlord, the Allied invasion of Normandy, France during World War II. It was the culmination of the Allied powers' strategy for the war and the beginning of a campaign of liberation to eliminate Nazi tyranny over the oppressed peoples of Europe. Thanks to the success at Normandy, Allied troops were able to lay the foundation for the final defeat of the Nazis during the following spring. The National Archives holds a multitude of records related to D-Day and its surrounding events. The records are in many formats: paper, photographs, film, and can be found in the Dwight D. Eisenhower Presidential Library and the National Archives at College Park. You can access many of these records by visiting the National Archives online catalog at catalog.archives.gov. Mitch Yockelson manages the National Archives and Records Administration's Archival Recovery Program, where he leads investigations of thefts of historical documents and museum artifacts. His work has been featured in the New York Times, Washington Post, and Los Angeles Times. Additionally, Mitch is a professor of military history at Norwich University and the author of 5 books and numerous articles and reviews. Mitch regularly leads tours of the Normandy battlefields for the New York Times Journeys and Smithsonian Journeys, and frequently lectures on military history. And now I'll turn you over to Mitch Yockelson. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Archivist Ferriero. Thank you, Archivist Ferriero, and thank you, everyone, depending on where you are. Good afternoon, perhaps good morning, or good evening. And for those of you who are tuning in later into our National Archives YouTube channel, I welcome you as well. On June 5th of 1944, around 11:45 p.m., Major General Maxwell Taylor, commander of the 101st Airborne, 45 years old on D-Day, the son of a Missouri country lawyer, took off on a C-47 and headed towards Normandy, France. He was part of the spearhead that would land the Airborne and help open up Utah Beach. About 2 hours later, Taylor would reach Normandy soil. He came down with his parachute with a bang. Now, keep in mind, this was the first time that Taylor had ever jumped into combat. He had gone through a paratrooper school like all of the other paratroopers under his charge. So he lands in this field in Normandy. And it's one of these surrounding big fields out in the country. If you've ever been to Normandy, you know exactly what I mean. As he struggled to get out of his parachute, he expected some of the men from the 101st, the Screaming Eagles, to be around to help him. But when he looked around, nobody was there. Not a single American soldier was in sight. As he said, only a circle of curious Norman cows who eyed me disapprovingly. I thought, as if resenting the intrusion into their pasture. Taylor would struggle for the next few moments, remove his chute, and when he heard Germans' guns open up in the next field. Eventually, the paratroopers came around. They rescued him, and Taylor and groups of men would head off towards where the pre-designated headquarters. A few minutes later, 49-year-old Matthew Ridgway, who was in command of the 82nd Airborne, the son of a career Army officer, 1918 grad of West Point, his descent out of the C-47 was fast, as he put it. But as he also put it, he hit a nice, soft, grassy field, but hit it hard. He was taught over and over again during paratrooper school to roll, to keep from breaking a limb, release the air from his canopy, and yank off his harness, which is exactly what he did. But Ridgway got a little bit nervous, grabbed the .45 caliber pistol from his waist, and as he slipped in out of the grasp of his parachute, he tumbled onto the grass. In the darkness, he pawed. His weapon had fallen onto the grass. He grabbed it, and nearby movement, he called out one of the pre-designated passwords, flash, anticipating that if he got a response from one of the men under his command, they would respond with thunder. But just like Taylor, there was only silence. But he did hear a noise, and much to his relief, it was moving from a cow. Ridgway would later write, "I could have kissed her," he recalled, because it meant that the pasture was not mined or booby-trapped. So now that I've introduced you to a little bit of Maxwell Taylor and Matthew Ridgway, they were the two commanders of the Airborne Divisions. They had every right to stay behind, but they decided that it was important that they jump into D-Day along with their men and start leading the mission. So what I'd like to do for the next 20 to 25 minutes is tell you about some of the men who served under Ridgway and Taylor, about some of the other men who were peripheral to the airborne operation. And if you like what I hear, go ahead and buy the book. It's for sale for 15% off the cover price. I promise you a lot better deal than if you go on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, or any of the other online booksellers. Next slide, please. So who were these paratroopers? Well, they were all volunteers to begin with. The Army started out in the late 1930s developing a paratrooper program. The guy to the left was at the time Colonel Bill Lee. He would eventually become known as the father of the paratroopers. Along with Chief of Staff George C. Marshall, he would work to organize the paratroopers and eventually form them into divisions. In fact, Lee would become the first commander of the 101st Division. He'd take them overseas to train in the months leading up to D-Day. But sadly, Lee had a bad heart, had a horrible heart attack, and General Eisenhower, who had appointed him as 101st commander, brought him back, and eventually Taylor was named as his replacement. So these paratroopers, as I say, they were volunteers. They learned about the paratrooper program through posters like the one you see in the middle there with the vibrant soldier carrying his weapon. In the background, you see the parachutes landing. These posters were placed in Army camps all around the United States. They were even placed outside of post offices and other civilian buildings. That way, if you saw this poster, you were enticed to join. To become a paratrooper, the standards were pretty rigid. First off, your muscles had to be firm and sound. You had to be capable of being an aggressive individual fighter with great endurance. You had to be between 20 and 30 years old. You couldn't weigh any more than 185 pounds. Your eyesight had to be at least 20/40 in each eye, and your systolic blood pressure couldn't exceed 140. Failure to meet any of these stringent criteria meant you were completely out of the program or not even considered altogether. For 4 weeks, the paratroopers would train down at Fort Benning, Georgia. It was mostly over the summer. It was hot, it was dry, and it was humid. They went through 4 stages named A, B, C, and D. Each day would start off with a 5-mile run. Commander, usually a staff sergeant, barking commands all the way. And then the day would start early at 5 a.m. They'd go through about an hour of calisthenics. As each week went on, they'd learn more and more about what it was like to be a paratrooper. For instance, the photographs that I show you there of the paratrooper tower, that's actually modeled off of a paratrooper tower that Lee had seen up in Coney Island, New York. And he thought, this is a great idea. So he ordered one for the War Department. And within the first couple of weeks, the paratrooper wannabes were jumping off of this tower and learning how to land properly, as Taylor had mentioned in his memoirs when he landed into Normandy. After the 4 weeks, if you passed your paratrooper training, you were awarded what the paratroopers called the coveted paratrooper boots. And they wore these proudly. They also got a paratrooper badge. And then, in a way, you went on to so-called additional paratrooper school, almost like graduate school. So they would go in, they'd get assigned to a particular unit, and they would learn more how to fight as a paratrooper, how to land. Now, this is what I'm talking about is about early 1942. So D-Day hadn't even been considered yet. This was on the peripheral. Paratroopers were going to soon become an important component of the United States Army. Next slide, please. One of the reasons that we know so much about the paratroopers today is because of a press agent by the name of Colonel Barney Oldfield. The name Barney Oldfield might mean something to you race car fans because his uncle was a famous race car driver. But Oldfield himself was just as vibrant. He was a colorful guy, and he's somebody that I kind of fell into as I was researching the book, and he became one of my favorite characters. He's from Nebraska, went to the University of Nebraska, studied journalism, worked for the Nebraska newspapers. He reviewed movies. He eventually had his own radio show. He did reviews for Billboard magazine. And then in the late 30s, he joined as a reserve officer in the U.S. Army Air Forces. Eventually, he would make his way through the ranks to lieutenant colonel and full colonel. But one of the things that he did was really neat, really interesting, is that as D-Day approached, he became higher up as far as the public relations guys go, the press guys. And he was directly under General Eisenhower Ike's charge. Eisenhower was very adamant that the coverage of the D-Day, the Normandy campaign, would be transparent. The correspondents would tell the American families, the American people back home, exactly what was going on. Of course, not to give away any of the secrets to the Germans. So Oldfield took it from there. He came up with an idea. He knew that a lot of journalists would want to cover the Normandy campaign. So he started his own recruitment by gathering up a number of war correspondents and saying to them, how would you like to jump into Normandy along with the paratroopers? Before he did this, Oldfield himself went to paratrooper school, went through the 4 weeks, got certified, got his jump boots, and then he went out and he recruited war correspondents. Among them was Bill Walton from Time magazine, not the basketball player, but a famous correspondent in his own right. Another one was Robert Rubin, who worked for Reuters newspaper. So the correspondents also went through paratrooper training school when they were assigned under the European theater in England. And they would jump into Normandy. One of the correspondents broke his leg. It couldn't go any further. Walton would jump in with his typewriter strapped underneath his parachute harness. Rubin would land, and he would send the first dispatch about the Normandy campaign, and he sent it by carrier pigeon. He put the message in a carrier pigeon along the English Channel. The bird successfully flew across the channel, didn't get shot down, made it to England, and eventually his story was filed. Next slide, please. So Operation Neptune, the Normandy landings, the D-Day landings, whatever you want to call them, this was the component of bringing the landing vessels, which would bring the troops, the infantry, some of the artillery and support units. But the spearhead was the airborne, and they were placed under Operation Neptune. And they had three really main missions, and that was to secure the roads and bridges inland from Utah Beach. Now, Utah Beach, as you'll see, is directly to the west of Omaha. It was one of the later beaches that was added during the planning period. In fact, when the British had originally concocted the idea of a Normandy landing, Utah wasn't even in the picture. But as the procedures and the objectives started to increase, it was recognized that Utah would be important. So they would jump, secure the roads and bridges, disrupt and surprise the German forces that they knew were in the area from reconnaissance photos. And then eventually this would allow the 4th Infantry Division, which was coming ashore at Utah, it would allow them to link up, and eventually, along with the 1st Division and the 29th Division coming ashore at Omaha, all of these forces would hopefully link up either later the first day, which became June 6th, or at the very latest the next day. Next slide, please. So as the planning went forward, there was a lot of concern about using the paratroopers. Eisenhower, who's in the middle, commander of the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Forces, SHAEF, the overall commander of the entire operation, man who's lots of burden on his shoulder, wasn't himself that strong about the paratroopers. He hadn't used them much before. During Operation Torch, there was a small paratrooper operation. Also in Sicily and in Italy in 1943. He had little experience, but he was concerned. The officer to his left, General Omar Bradley, who was in charge of 1st Army, which is what the 82nd and 101st would fall under, was extremely adamant about having the paratroopers. And eventually a tug of war would ensue between Bradley and the officer to the right of Eisenhower, who was Air Chief Marshal Sir Trafford Leigh-Mallory. Leigh-Mallory, a brilliant air officer who helped concoct some of the forces that fought against the Germans during the German invasion during the Battle of Britain. Eisenhower trusted him deeply. Leigh-Mallory was very concerned that if the American airborne plus the British airborne would jump into Normandy, there would be catastrophic casualties. He figured that the Germans would shoot down the paratroopers either while they're still in the C-47 transports, which I'll tell you about in a moment, or as they jumped out of the planes. Plus, there were gliders that would be towed by the C-47s. They were even more vulnerable. Leigh-Mallory's thinking there's going to be somewhere in the neighborhood of 80% casualties. And he gets Eisenhower's ear and tells him, "Sir, I really believe that you need to scrap the airborne." Well, Eisenhower conveys this to Bradley, who he had great respect for, and Bradley said, "Sir, if you go with Leigh-Mallory, then I'm going to have to tell you that Utah Beach, without having the paratroopers spearheading, opening up the exits, without them, we can't do this." So Eisenhower was somewhat in a quandary. Eventually, he gave the go-ahead. And then we get to May of 1944, about a month before the Normandy invasion. And Allied intelligence recognizes that one of the crack German divisions has actually landed smack dab in the middle of where the 82nd Division drop zone is going to take place. This is where this German unit They knew that the Americans, the Allies, the British, Canadian forces were all going to invade somewhere. It might happen in Normandy, maybe as a diversion. It might happen elsewhere along the channel. So the German troops had placed all sorts of obstacles, including what was known as Rommel's asparagus. Erwin Rommel, the famous tank commander, was in charge of the Normandy coastline and building the so-called Atlantic Wall. So these German troops land, and this sets Leigh-Mallory off even more. He again runs to Eisenhower, contacts him, and says, "See, I told you, this is going to be a disaster." Eisenhower thinks about it, confers with his other officers, and at the last minute, the 82nd Airborne landings are shifted more close to the 101st Airborne, and that way to avoid the German troops. Although Leigh-Mallory is still nervous about this, Eisenhower says, "I'm going with the Airborne." And Eisenhower at this point is living in his so-called circus tent in Portsmouth, England, in the days leading up to the Normandy invasion. Go ahead, the next slide, please. So the support to provide for the Airborne was led by General Lewis H. Brereton. He's in command of 9th Carrier Command. Underneath him are what Eisenhower would call one of the most vital tools of the war, the Douglas Aircraft Company's C-47 Troop Skytrain. They were named C-47s early in the war. The Skytrain actually was originally a commercial airplane to take passengers across country and eventually overseas. The Army, Air Forces would purchase thousands of these aircrafts throughout the war. Many of them were constructed in either California at Long Beach or also in Oklahoma. They would carry the troops from air bases in England across the English Channel. Later on in the evening of D-Day and then in the early morning of D-Day +1, gliders attached to the C-47s would bring some of the officers and larger equipment like jeeps, artillery pieces, plus medical equipment, signal equipment. Many of them were made by the Waco Aircraft Company in Ohio. They developed under contract with a number of other companies the CG-A4 glider, which is one of the predominant gliders used by the U.S. Army Air Forces during the war in Europe and elsewhere. Next slide, please. So as D-Day approached, the paratroopers themselves were well equipped. And when they boarded the C-47s, they were heavily weighted down. Among the items they carried were flotation devices, life vests, that were nicknamed Mae West because they expanded in the chest area. They were also supplied with maps, hand grenades, a compass, an entrenching tool, a canteen, a knife, a rifle, a machine gun, affectionately known as a Tommy gun, pistols, ammunition belt, first aid kits, but they also had 2 parachutes, the main parachute and a reserve parachute. They were also provided with, at the time, French francs, money in case they got separated from their units. They needed help from the French people, and they needed to perhaps bribe them with money. Next slide, please. On the evening of June 5th, 1944, Eisenhower, extremely nervous about the Airborne. He still got Leigh-Mallory in his ear telling him it's going to be a disaster. So to ease his mind and hopefully ease the mind of some of the paratroopers, he decides to visit them. He initially wanted to visit both the 82nd and the 101st. But what happened is Matthew Ridgway asked Barney Oldfield, who put in the request for Eisenhower, not to have Ike visit the 82nd camps. He thought it would be a distraction, and he felt as though he wanted Eisenhower, with all respect, I guess, to stay away. So Eisenhower would go and visit the paratroopers where the 101st took off. This famous photograph, one of the most iconic photos of the war, was taken at Greenham Airfield. Eisenhower went there late in the evening. He was driven by his aide, K. Summersby. He walked around the airfield after visiting other 101st sites, met with the paratroopers, talked to them, wanted to know where they were from, how they felt. He wished them luck, had dinner with Maxwell Taylor, and then as the planes started to fill with the paratroopers, started to taxi down the runways, he stayed. And he watched as the last plane took off, and as Case Summersby would report, with tears in his eyes, and then he went back to his circus tent at Portsmouth and to wait for word of what would happen. Next slide, please. So on the way to Normandy, the route had been set where the planes, once they took off, they were in serials, groups of planes, and they would rendezvous about 20 miles east over Birmingham, England. And despite the large number of planes in the air and the potential danger of collision in the darkness, the planes still formed in a perfect V of V, 6 planes together in each V, and then they would join the rest of the airborne armada. From this point, the serials then would fly about 60 miles southwest and head over the English Channel, over the Severn Estuary. From there, they flew south another 60 miles for a command assembly point, and then eventually they would fly over Navy vessels who were in the English Channel that provided navigational tools. Now, you should be aware that the planes had no radio contact and no lights, so they were basically flying blind. At another point on a sandy cape called Portland Bill, they would then fly straight over the channel for 57 miles before they would reach the drop zones in Normandy. Next slide, please. Preceding the paratroopers were the so-called Pathfinders. The first Pathfinder to lead the troops into Normandy, and the first to really drop into Normandy, was Captain Frank L. Lillyman from upstate New York, who had a fondness for cigars. In fact, it said that he dropped into Normandy with a cigar in his mouth. And the idea of the Pathfinders was to lay down navigational aids, some of them called Rebecca's and other devices. And then they would lay out these white sheets that would provide at least some sort of landing aid to the C-47s. It was a dangerous mission, and as the Pathfinders landed, the Germans got wind that the paratroopers were coming in, and a number of firefights ensued. Lillyman would survive, as would most of the troops under his command. By and large, the Pathfinders were pretty successful in placing the navigational aids. Some of them landed far from the drop zones, which would cause a problem, and I'll mention that in a moment. Next slide, please. Right before the planes were taking off, the aircraft were visited by officers and in some cases some of the war correspondents. One of the most interesting that I learned about in writing the book was a guy named Wright Bryan. He was a war correspondent for the Atlanta Journal, and then eventually he became a broadcaster for NBC. He was stationed in England. He would fly along with one of the planes commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Robert Cole of the 101st Airborne. Cole would later on be awarded the Medal of Honor during a later campaign, unfortunately posthumously, as he was killed in action. But Wright Bryan, who's over 6 feet tall, goes aboard the plane that has Cole and some of the 18 men that they called a stick, and he starts asking him questions. And one of the paratroopers he meets is this guy, Robert G. Hillman. Hillman is very confident. He's smiling. He's not as nervous as some of the other paratroopers. And Bryan asked him, "So how do you feel, son?" Hillman would respond, "I feel pretty good. The reason is I know my chute's okay. I know it's going to open up because my mother checked it. She worked for the Pioneer Parachute Company in Manchester, Connecticut, where actually he had worked. So I know that she checked the parachute and I'm going to be okay." Hillman was correct. He landed. He was slightly wounded, but he would go on for the rest of the campaign and fight in the rest of the war with the 101st Airborne. I spoke to one of his daughters, and she said after the war, he was known to ride his bike around Manchester, Connecticut, proudly wearing his paratrooper boots. Next slide, please. The airborne drop zones from this map were all around the rivers and in some cases around swampy areas. When the reconnaissance planes took images, some of the swampy areas weren't recognized, and this ended up becoming disastrous for some of the troops. As the planes were dropping in looking for the Pathfinder navigational aids, many of them were shot at. Out of the 800 planes that flew into Normandy on the night of June 5th into the morning of June 6th, about 20 of them were shot down. A large number of the planes would drop the paratroopers anywhere from 10 to 20 miles from the drop zones. Some of the paratroopers with their heavy equipment landed in swampy areas and instantly drowned. As the morning went on, though, the paratroopers regrouped, and by late morning or towards the end of the day, many of them were able to regroup with their units. Next slide, please. But as they were like Ridgway and Taylor, they were scattered among Normandy's pastures, among these huge hedgerows, which are these large natural borders that farmers would use to keep the cows in their pastures. Some of the paratroopers landed in villages, and as I mentioned, too many of them landed in these marshes, and if they couldn't get out, couldn't release their parachutes, it was a dangerous situation. The paratroopers on the 101st Airborne carried the so-called crickets that you see at the bottom there. They were developed in England as a tool to use by orchestras to help keep time. When the 82nd Division jumped into Italy in 1943, they used these crickets, and they would click on them twice. And the idea was if one of your fellow paratroopers was nearby, they would click once, and they knew that you were safe. It was primarily used by the 101st Airborne. The 82nd, Ridgway thought it was a bad idea since these things would fall out of the uniforms, and he didn't heavily issue them like Taylor did. Next slide. The Coffins that the gliders that I mentioned were unfortunately called flying coffins, as demonstrated by what happened to Brigadier General Don Pratt. Pratt was assistant commander to Taylor. And on the late morning of June 6th, he was in the first glider mission to bring jeeps and other equipment over. As his glider landed, it was shot at by the Germans. It crash landed into the Normandy terrain and careened into some trees. Pratt was killed instantly and became the highest ranking officer killed on D-Day. He would later be replaced by one of the 101st Airborne officers. Next slide, please. On the first day, one of the objectives of Ridgway's 82nd Airborne was to liberate Sainte-Mère-Église. This village straddled one of the main highways that led towards Utah Beach. The fight for Sainte-Mère-Église lasted most of the day and seesawed back and forth. The Germans were stubborn. They wouldn't give up. And finally, the Americans were able to liberate the village. The village had actually caught on fire right around the time that the paratroopers were landing. It's believed that one of a bomb had fallen out of one of the American planes that were strafing the area right around the time of the paratroopers and caused the fire. But eventually Sainte-Mère-Église was liberated and maintained by the Americans, which helped open up one of the causeways and exits leading from Utah Beach. Next slide, please. Another fight nearby, which lasted almost 3 days, is one of the more brutal attacks, was at Fière, a bridge shown in the photograph. General James Gavin, who would become one of the heroes of World War II, eventually the commander of the 82nd Division, a unique individual known as the soldier's soldier. At 17 years old, the Mount Carmel, Pennsylvania native left home, took a train to New York, and would eventually join the Army as a recruit. His Army commander saw that he had potential, asked him if he wanted to go to West Point, and helped him through with the West Point examination. He would graduate West Point, saw the potential of the paratroopers, and command a paratrooper regiment, eventually becoming assistant commander of the 82nd. And as I mentioned, later on after Normandy, when Ridgway was promoted to Corps commander, Ridgway would take over the 82nd. Next slide, please. One of the main tasks of the 101st Airborne was to liberate the village of Sainte-Mère-Église, which they did after a day of heavy fighting. And then eventually Carentan, which became an important landmark to help link up not only the paratroopers and the 4th Division, but also to link up with Omaha Beach. Carentan was a dairy village. There were a number of cows. Carnation had a instant milk factory there. The fighting for Carentan would take place over the course of 3 days, leading through a causeway. A number of Americans were casualties. Eventually, the village was captured by the 101st after a few days. The Germans counterattacked, killing a number of Americans and wounding many more. Finally, the Americans, with the help of artillery, did their own counterattack and would take over. After about 40 days of continuous fighting, both the 82nd and the 101st Airborne were relieved and went back to England. Next slide, please. So I've given you a quick overview of these two divisions. Overall, there were about 13,000 American paratroopers who arrived in Normandy on about 87 of these C-47s. Eventually, 100 gliders would come over, many of them getting destroyed as they either flew over the landing zones or crash landed. But they still managed to bring in about 3,900 glider troops. Of the whole U.S. Army Air Forces command, there were about 5,000 crew. Casualties for the American Airborne were about 1,000 killed, 2,600 wounded, and more than 4,000 missing. And this is not just on D-Day. This is the entire campaign that lasted from June 6th all the way through about the 13th of July, 1944. And the big question to ask and to try and answer is, overall, was the Airborne successful? Now, we know that Leigh-Mallory thought that it was going to be a disaster. Most of the troops did land, albeit far from their drop zones. And once word reached the Allied commanders in England that the paratroopers had mostly successfully landed, and Leigh-Mallory heard this, he immediately called Eisenhower and apologized to him for worrying him. The paratroopers did indeed help open up the exits from Utah Beach, which allowed the 4th Infantry Division to come forward and eventually link up Utah Beach. Despite the heavy casualties and the fact that it took more than a day, in fact, several days, to get all of these areas secured as the troops started coming inland. And this was because of strong German resistance. It's fairly accurate to say that the airborne landings, the paratroopers, were quite successful. So that's the story of Generals Ridgway and Taylor, the paratrooper generals, and the troops that served under them. I'll take a look now to see if we have any questions, and feel free, we still have several minutes left. If you've got questions, please send them forward. Otherwise, if you want to learn more, by all means, support the National Archives and our programs by picking up a book. And you can certainly email me later on if you think of a question or you're watching this on YouTube. You could send your email to inquire@nara.gov or to me directly through my National Archives email, which is my first full name, Mitchell, Mitchell, my last name, Yockelson, Yockelson, @nara.gov. I thank you again for tuning in to us, for supporting the National Archives, our programs, and I appreciate your time and attention. Well, we don't seem to have any questions yet. I'm sure you're all mulling this in your minds. So on behalf of the archives, I will tune off right now. Hold on, we do have one. The age of the young general, the one that went through West Point. I don't remember, I'm sorry, his exact age, but he was in his early 30s at the time that he went to West Point. I'm sorry, he went to Normandy. I'm not sure if you're asking how old he was at West Point. He was a little bit older, but he was in his early to mid 30s at the time in Normandy. Okay, well, thank you, everyone, and I appreciate it, and I look forward to hearing from you perhaps later on.